Welcome to Extraterrestrial Reality. Last week, Steven Spielberg, the famous film director, appeared on Steven Colbert's late night show on CBS and was talking about UFOs and that he believes that there is a government cover-up. It's interesting to hear something like this coming from someone like Steven Spielberg. And here is an article about it that was in the Fox News website. The headline reads, Steven Spielberg concerned about secrecy, lack of transparency around UFO sightings. Something is going on. Okay, and this is what the article states. It says, filmmaker Steven Spielberg raised concern about the secrecy and lack of transparency from the government surrounding unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP sightings. The famous director, known for his several blockbuster science fiction films, including the alien movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, admitted he was excited and fascinated by the unexplained phenomena, better known as UFOs. Spielberg suggested the topic needed more attention from the United States government. I think what has been coming out recently is fascinating, just absolutely fascinating, he said on The Late Show with Steven Colbert. A United States intelligence report from January revealed a surge in supposed UFO sightings over the past 2 years. The famous director theorized that there was something going on and the government wasn't being open with the public about it. I think the secrecy that is shrouding all of these sightings and the lack of transparency until the Freedom of Information Act compels certain materials to be released publicly, I think that there is something going on that simply needs extraordinary due diligence, he argued. Spielberg said his imagination and curiosity prompted him to believe there was a story not being told. There's something going on that that's not being disclosed to us, he emphasized. I would like to hear more about it. I don't know what they are, Spielberg added. Spielberg said while he had never seen anything himself, he couldn't explain in the sky. He believed others had witnessed things that they couldn't explain. He also didn't believe man was alone in the universe. I think it's mathematically impossible, he said. While several of Spielberg's films deal with government cover-ups of alien encounters, UAP have made their way into real life recently as well. And then they go on talking about the stupid Chinese spy balloon, which has nothing to do with the extraterrestrial reality. Well, Spielberg actually, when he was making Close Encounters of the Third Kind, he actually interviewed J. Allen Hynek, who was, considered the father of ufology now. He started out, of course, as everyone knows, Hynek started out as a skeptical scientist who was working with the government for Project Blue Book with the United States Air Force from the 50s into the late 60s until Project Blue Book closed. And he would try to basically explain away UFO sightings, but as time went on, he became convinced that there was a lot more to it. So Hynek started out as a skeptic and became a believer, and then when Spielberg went to make Close Encounters of the Third Kind in the late 70s, he called upon Hynek as an advisor, and Hynek actually makes a small appearance in that movie. What's interesting about this whole thing is that Spielberg, that was like one of the first alien movie that I saw in the movies when I was a kid, and it was not around that same time where I had my experience with what I later realized was an actual extraterrestrial. So my extraterrestrial encounter, I was 8 going on 9. That happened in 1977. And then Close Encounters of the Third Kind was released late in 1977. And it didn't show up to the local movie theater where I lived at the time until sometime in 1978. And I'll never forget going to see that in the movies at the time. My dad took me and my brother Dave to see it, and it was just mind-blowing at the time when you're a young kid seeing something like that on the big screen. It just was fantastic. But the whole thing is even before that movie, though, I was used to seeing science fiction movies on TV from the 50s, 60s, and from the early 70s about aliens and UFOs, flying saucers. Mostly 50s movies that I remembered seeing on TV growing up. But I always just thought, at that time, I thought it was all fantasy. Things back then in the 70s are a lot different than they are now. I mean, you just didn't have access to information back then like we do now. Like when you're, if we would have had the internet and things like that, I would have known that there was a such thing as alien abduction and the possibility that flying saucers are really coming here and that there are alien beings in them. I would have known that, but I didn't. I never really knew that. Most of the documentaries I remember watching when I was a kid, focused on things like Bigfoot, the abominable snowman, and, speculative documentaries. Bigfoot, the abominable snowman, the Loch Ness Monster, the mysteries of the Bermuda Triangle, but I just don't recall ever seeing any kind of documentary during that whole time when growing up about aliens or the possibility that they're real, that they might be actually coming here. I didn't understand when I was watching movies like, say, The Thing from Another World, or Earth versus the Flying Saucers, or War of the Worlds, or any of these movies that they were showing back then, that the reason that those movies were popular in the 1950s was because of the sightings that started cropping up starting in 1947. Basically in 1947, you had Kenneth Arnold had that experience flying over Washington State, where he saw 9 discs, basically 9 objects floating around, like skipping, like flying as if they were like discs that somebody would skip across water. And from there, it just took off, and people were seeing these things. These things were getting reported. There were pictures taken of some of them. The 1950 McMinnville incident comes to mind, where there was 2 really good pictures of a flying saucer that was hovering over this farm property owned by Paul and Evelyn Trent. That became a big thing, and then by 1951 they started making movies that were inspired by these sightings of UFOs, and 2 of the first big movies of 1951, 2 of the first big science fiction movies actually came out in 1951. The Thing from Another World and The Day the Earth Stood Still, and it just kept on going on from there for the rest of the 1950s. There were all kinds of movies talking that dealt with beings from other planets, but even though I was watching those things, it's so strange. Growing up, I did not know that the reason that those movies were actually made. They were made because they were inspired by what was going on in real life. There was a lot of mystery behind flying saucers throughout the 50s, into the 60s. And so by the time, when I was born in 1968, and, growing up in the 70s, you would see a lot of these movies were repeated on TV on a regular basis, and you would see them all the time, along with a lot of monster movies like Frankenstein and Dracula. They would also have flying saucer movies, alien invasion movies, giant bug movies from the 50s. There was all those kind of things. And I always thought that flying saucers was just a product of Hollywood growing up. Even Close Encounters of the Third Kind, I never was able to put it all together, because again, back then things were different. If you didn't sit down and see something reported on TV, and I never read the newspaper when I was a kid. I didn't really care about that kind of stuff. I was worried about playing baseball and running around outside and having a good time growing up as a kid. And there were no cell phones, and you just didn't have the internet, so there was no information being fed to you on a regular basis about this kind of stuff. And it wasn't until, I would say, 1980, and I was watching a documentary with my dad. There used to be this TV show that was hosted by Leonard Nimoy called In Search Of, that we talk about all different kinds of strange things. People who are my age, probably, I'm sure some of you remember this TV series. It's excellent. You could actually find a lot of the episodes on, I believe all of the episodes, somebody has them uploaded onto YouTube. It was a great series, but the one time I was watching, and I had watched several episodes of this, from the late 70s into 1980, but there was the one episode where they were talking about UFO crashes, about a government cover-up, and I remember sitting there watching this with my dad, and that must have been the episode actually where Jesse Marcel Sr. was talking about what happened at Roswell, and I was saying to my dad, I said, "So flying saucers are real?" He's like, "Yeah, didn't you know that?" No, I was like, "No, I didn't know that. I didn't know that it was based on reality. That's something that really might be going on with this stuff. I didn't know anything about that." But, time went on after that, and it wasn't until like the late 1980s where I saw some other documentary on TV where alien abductions were mentioned. I didn't know anything about Betty and Barney Hill, all of that kind of stuff, Travis Walton. I knew nothing about that growing up, 70s into the late 80s. It wasn't until like the late 80s when I started discovering all this information in documentaries on TV mostly. And that's when, it clicked in my brain that thing that was in my room that night in 1977 was an alien. It took a little time. Like, I didn't put it I started thinking that initially, but it took me a little while to finally come to that conclusion that that's what it was. That's what it had to be. There was definitely something there, right? There was most certainly some being was in the room that night, and I just never figured it out. I didn't know that alien abduction was a thing. But it's interesting, like even when I went to see in 1978, when I finally got the chance to see Close Encounters of the Third Kind in the movies, I thought it was fascinating and everything. I loved it, of course. Spielberg, I mean, he was, one of the best directors of all time. Some of my favorite movies he directed: Raiders of the Lost Ark, Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I mean, Schindler's List, Jurassic Park. I mean, there's just so many different great movies that he made that I appreciate a lot. But I just never put two and two together. Not until much later on, I didn't realize that even Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The reason, I mean, basically, a lot of the stuff that happens in that movie was based on, a lot of the things that people report about. Like, Richard Dreyfuss, who's the main star of the film, when he looks out of the truck he's driving, and there's a flying UFO hovering right above his truck, and he gets a half of his face sunburned. Those kind of things were reported. These kind of strange phenomenon happened to people during UFO encounters sometimes. And it's just interesting to see Spielberg. I mean, now some of the things, now I watched the entire interview. I'll leave the link, of course, for this article and also for the interview that he had with Colbert. I don't want to put that on this podcast because it could be considered copyright infringement. But you could check it out for yourself. Now, some of the things he was saying, Spielberg said that all gray aliens, for some reason, never wear clothes. Now, he's wrong about that. Obviously, Spielberg hasn't done enough research into this, right? That's not true. I mean, how many different reports? I guess there are some people that say that when they encounter these beings that they're not wearing clothes, but a lot of the reports, a lot of the famous ones, they're wearing some sort of uniform, these beings. The Betty and Barney Hill case, the Travis Walton case, these gray aliens are wearing some sort of uniforms. According to the reports out of Roswell from 1947, a lot of the witnesses stated that they were wearing uniforms, like, one-piece coveralls. So he's wrong about some aspects of it, but at least it's nice to see someone of his stature pointing out the fact that the reality, because again, when you have people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, everyone knows his face and everyone knows who he is. He's an astronomer. He's an authority figure when it comes to space, right? When you have someone like him coming on saying there's nothing to it, that's basically spreading a lie. Obviously, Neil deGrasse Tyson has no understanding. He's not read any books on this. He's not researched this, and it's very, very obvious. But to see someone like Spielberg, although you could tell that he doesn't know everything, you could tell that he's not really learned on this topic, but he knows enough to realize that there's a cover-up, and it's good to have a voice like Steven Spielberg coming out and saying, hey, there's a government cover-up here with UFOs, and there needs to be more stated about this. So, I highly recommend, like, if you haven't seen this interview, I highly, highly recommend that you check it out because it's extremely interesting. And I think this is a good thing. This is another step forward when you have a figure, a celebrity like someone like Steven Spielberg's stature. I mean, he's going to go down in history as one of the greatest directors of all time, along with people like John Huston, Alfred Hitchcock, Stanley Kubrick, Spielberg. One of the greatest directors of all time coming out and saying the government's covering up the UFO phenomena. They know a lot more. They're not saying anything. They're not telling us everything. That's big. That's important. So that's a good step forward. There's a lot of people that watch these late night TV shows like the Steven Colbert Late Show. So that's good that we have something like this happening, and I appreciate it. As someone who wants to get to end this whole UFO secrecy nonsense, this is a good thing. So I'm very happy about that, and I thought it was something that should be discussed.